The early morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Thompson's carefully tended garden as he slowly made his way down the stone path he had laid with his own hands 30 years ago. At 93 years old, his steps were careful but purposeful, each movement a testament to a life lived with determination. His weathered hands gripped a wooden cane, though he used it more for balance than support, his military bearings still evident in his straight posture despite his advanced age. Every morning, Frank followed the same routine he had maintained since his beloved wife, Martha, passed away 5 years ago. He would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., a habit formed during his days as a combat medic in World War II, make his bed with hospital corners, and dress himself in clean, pressed clothes. Today, he wore his favorite light blue button-down shirt, khaki pants, and his well-polished brown leather shoes. The small town of Cedar Grove was just beginning to wake up as Frank tended to his prized roses. These weren't just any roses, they were Martha's favorites, and he had promised her he would keep them blooming. The garden was his sanctuary, a peaceful haven where memories of happier times lived in every flower and shrub. His neighbors often stopped to admire the stunning display of colors, from deep reds to soft pinks, all meticulously arranged in neat rows. At 8:30 a.m., just like every other day, Frank locked his front door and began his short walk to Sally's diner. The morning air was crisp, and the familiar sounds of birds chirping and children heading to school filled the quiet streets. The diner sat at the corner of Maple and Oak Streets, its red and chrome exterior a throwback to simpler times. The bell above the door chimed as Frank pushed it open, announcing his arrival to the familiar faces inside. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," Sally herself called out from behind the counter. She was a kind-faced woman in her 50s who had inherited the diner from her father. Her own father had been a veteran too, and she had a soft spot for the old soldier who had become such a steady presence in her establishment. Frank made his way to his usual booth, the third one from the window, where he could watch the town go about its daily business. Without having to order, Sally brought over his regular breakfast: 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, crispy bacon, and a cup of black coffee. The other regulars at the diner treated him with a mixture of respect and fondness, often stopping by his table to chat or simply nod in acknowledgement. As he ate his breakfast, Frank's mind wandered back to his days in service. The young people in town saw him as just another elderly resident, but behind his gentle blue eyes lay memories of the Battle of the Bulge, where he had saved countless lives as a combat medic. His hands, now carefully cutting his toast, had once stitched wounds under enemy fire and carried wounded soldiers to safety through the freezing Ardennes forest. After the war, Frank had returned home to Cedar Grove, married his high school sweetheart Martha, and built a life filled with love and quiet dignity. They never had children of their own, but they had each other, and that had been enough. He had worked as the town's pharmacist for 40 years, continuing his mission of helping others in a different way. The diner's regulars had become something of a family to Frank since Martha's passing. There was Tom, the local mail carrier, who always saved interesting stories from his route to share. Sarah, a young waitress working her way through college, reminded him of Martha in her younger days and always made sure his coffee cup was never empty. And old Bill, another veteran who served in Korea, would join him every Thursday for their weekly chess game. As Frank finished his breakfast and left his usual generous tip, he had no way of knowing that his peaceful routine was about to be dramatically disrupted. The quiet life he had carefully built in this small town was about to face a challenge that would reveal to everyone that there was much more to this elderly veteran than met the eye. He stepped out of the diner into the morning sunshine, nodding to Mrs. Peterson as she hurried past with her shopping bags, completely unaware that by this time next week, his life would never be the same. The peace of Cedar Grove began to change on a warm Tuesday afternoon in late spring. Frank was carefully pruning his rose bushes when he first heard it, the deep rumble of motorcycle engines approaching from the distance. At first, he paid little attention. Motorcycles occasionally passed through their quiet town, but this time, the sound didn't fade away. Instead, it grew louder and seemed to settle in the vacant lot next door to his property. Through the gaps in his wooden fence, Frank watched as a group of about 15 motorcycles pulled into the empty space. Their chrome pipes gleamed in the sunlight, and their black leather-clad riders dismounted with the confidence of people claiming new territory. The bikes bore the emblem of the Iron Riders Motorcycle Club, a skull wearing an iron crown, its eyes glowing red. The bikers were setting up what looked like a temporary camp, complete with folding chairs and coolers full of beer. Their loud laughter and rough language carried easily across Frank's usually peaceful garden. He noticed how some of them kept looking over at his property, pointing and talking among themselves. The youngest ones couldn't have been more than 25, while their leader, a tall man with a gray-streaked beard and arms covered in tattoos, appeared to be in his 50s. That evening, as Frank tried to enjoy his dinner, the noise from next door made it impossible to hear his small television set. The sounds of revving engines, loud music, and shouting continued well into the night. Several times, empty beer cans landed in his garden, crushing some of his prized petunias. The next morning, Frank decided to handle the situation like the gentleman he was. He put on his best shirt, grabbed his cane, and walked over to the lot where several bikers were already gathering. As he approached, he could smell cigarette smoke and leftover beer. "Good morning," Frank said politely, his voice clear and steady. "I'm Frank Thompson, your neighbor. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood, but I also needed to ask if you could keep the noise down a bit, especially in the evening. You see, many of us elderly folks live around here, and—" Well, what do we have here?" The leader interrupted, stepping forward. His name patch reads Snake. The other bikers gathered around, forming a loose circle. "Looks like Grandpa here doesn't appreciate our music poise." Laughter rippled through the group. Snake walked closer to Frank, towering over him. "Listen here, old-timer. This is our spot now. We bought it fair and square last week, and we'll make all the noise we want. Maybe it's time for you to find yourself a nice retirement home, huh?" Frank stood his ground, his military training kicking in automatically. He'd faced down Nazi soldiers in the Ardennes. He wasn't about to be intimidated by these bullies. "I understand this is your property now," he said calmly, "but there are noise ordinances in this town that everyone needs to follow." Snake leaned down until his face was inches from Frank's. "Ordinances? That's cute. Here's what's going to happen, Gramps. You're going to walk back to your little house, and you're going to pretend we don't exist. Because if you cause any trouble—" He let the threat hang in the air. Frank looked around at the sneering faces surrounding him. He noticed details that his military training had taught him to observe: license plate numbers, distinctive tattoos, the patches on their jackets that showed rank within their organization. His mind, still sharp as ever, filed away each piece of information. Without another word, Frank turned and walked back to his house, his steps measured and dignified. Behind him, the bikers erupted in mocking laughter and engine revving. But if they had looked closer, they would have seen no fear in his eyes. Instead, there was something else, a calculating look that hadn't crossed his face since his days in military intelligence. That afternoon, the Iron Riders made sure to be extra loud, celebrating what they saw as a victory over the old man. They had no idea that their real problems were just beginning, or that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives by underestimating Frank Thompson. Over the next 2 weeks, life became increasingly difficult for Frank Thompson. The Iron Riders had turned their harassment into something of a game, seeing how far they could push the elderly veteran before he broke. Each morning, Frank would wake up to find new damage to his property, each act more spiteful than the last. On Monday, they knocked over his mailbox. Frank spent 3 hours in the hot sun digging a new post hole and setting it straight, his arthritic hands protesting with every movement. By Tuesday evening, they had spray-painted crude words across it. The black paint covered the hand-painted flowers that Martha had decorated it with 15 years ago. Wednesday brought worse news. Frank stepped out to tend his garden, only to find his roses trampled and pulled from the ground. Martha's precious roses, which he had tended so carefully since her passing, lay scattered and broken across the lawn. His hands trembled as he knelt to gather the destroyed flowers, but his face remained composed. The bikers, watching from their lot, raised their beer cans and laughed. "Called the police again, old-timer?" Snake shouted across the fence. "How'd that work out for you?" Frank had indeed called the local police several times. Officer Jim Parker, who had known Frank for years, could only offer sympathetic words. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," he had said, shuffling uncomfortably. "But unless we catch them in the act, there's not much we can do. These guys, they have connections. The department's been told to handle them with kid gloves." The harassment continued at Sally's Diner. Whenever Frank would come in for his breakfast, members of the Iron Riders would make sure to occupy the surrounding booths. They would talk loudly about how certain old folks needed to learn their place or how accidents could happen to people who didn't mind their own business. Sally tried her best to protect her longtime customer. "You leave Mr. Thompson alone," she would say firmly, but even she grew quiet when Snake and his inner circle started frequenting the diner. She had a business to run and teenage daughters to support. She couldn't afford trouble. The other regulars at the diner, who had always been so friendly with Frank, began to avoid eye contact. They would quickly finish their meals and leave, afraid to be associated with the man who had become a target. Only Sarah, the young waitress, still showed him kindness, though she had to do it discreetly. One morning, Frank found a note slipped under his door. It was typed, making it impossible to identify the sender's handwriting. Final WRNNE, it read. "CL your hey west to US, our $50,000 or things well get poor rusty. You have 1 week." Frank knew his property was worth at least 5 times that amount. More importantly, it was the home he had shared with Martha for 50 years. Every room held memories of their life together. The kitchen still had the marks on the wall where they had measured their godchildren's heights over the years. The living room window still had the small crack from when Martha had accidentally hit it with a tennis ball 20 years ago. That evening, as Frank sat in his favorite armchair by the window, he watched the Iron Riders holding another of their loud parties next door. Through the gathering darkness, he could see them pointing at his house, laughing and making threatening gestures. The sound of breaking glass told him another beer bottle had been thrown over his fence. Frank's weathered hands rested on a small wooden box in his lap, one he hadn't opened since 1945. Inside were memories of another time when he wasn't just a combat medic but something more. Something that these bikers, with all their swagger and intimidation, couldn't begin to understand. His fingers traced the box's worn edges as he made his decision. He had tried handling this situation the peaceful way, the way Martha would have wanted. But now it was time to show these bullies that they had made a serious mistake in choosing their target. Frank Thompson had not survived the Battle of the Bulge, saved countless lives under enemy fire, and served in military intelligence by being weak. Tomorrow, he would make some calls. That night, after making his decision, Frank climbed the narrow stairs to his attic. His flashlight beam cut through years of dust, finally settling on an old military trunk pushed against the far wall. He hadn't opened it in decades, but the combination lock clicked open at his first try, some things you never forget. Inside, beneath his combat medic uniform and a stack of yellowed letters from Martha, lay a false bottom that only he knew about. Frank's fingers found the hidden catch, and the secret compartment opened with a soft click. There, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather folder stamped with words that would shock anyone who thought they knew the quiet old veteran. Office of Strategic Services, European Operations. Few people knew that Frank Thompson had been more than just a combat medic during World War II. His role as a medic had been real. He had indeed saved many lives on the battlefield, but it had also been the perfect cover for his other duties. While treating wounded soldiers, he could move freely behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence that helped the Allies win crucial battles. Frank settled into his old rocking chair, the folder open on his lap. His hands, which had trembled while picking up his destroyed roses earlier that day, were now steady as he went through the documents. Photos of his old team, most of them now gone, brought back memories of covert operations in occupied France. Code books, mission reports, and commendations signed by officials whose names were still classified reminded him of the man he used to be. But what really interested Frank were the contact numbers on the last page. These weren't the kind of phone numbers you'd find in any directory. They were emergency contact protocols, given only to operatives of his level, meant to last a lifetime. In all his years since the war, he had never used them. He had wanted a quiet life with Martha, had chosen to become just the local pharmacist who grew roses and fed birds. As he read through the documents, Frank's mind was already working like it used to during the war. He had been meticulously documenting everything the Iron Riders had done. His old camera, hidden behind his curtains, had captured clear photos of their illegal activities. His small notebook contained dates, times, license plate numbers, and names he had overheard. He had even noticed patterns in their operations that suggested this wasn't just a local motorcycle club causing trouble. The way they handled money during their meetings, the coded patches on their jackets, the regular visits from out-of-state members, it all pointed to something bigger. Frank might look like a frail old man, but his mind was as sharp as ever. His training had taught him to observe, analyze, and connect dots that others might miss. He opened his laptop, a gift from his godson that he had learned to use quite well, and began typing. All his observations, photographs, and notes were organized into a detailed report, just like he used to write during the war. The Iron Riders thought they were dealing with a helpless old veteran, but they had no idea they were actually tangling with someone who had helped bring down Nazi spy networks. Frank worked through the night, his table lamp casting a soft glow through his window. Outside, the Iron Riders were having another noisy party, completely unaware that the old man they were tormenting was quietly building a case that would lead to their downfall. By dawn, Frank had finished his report. He made himself a cup of coffee and watched the sunrise, something he hadn't done since his days in the service. The morning light revealed new graffiti on his fence, crude threats sprawled in black spray paint. But for the first time in weeks, Frank smiled. He knew something that Snake and his gang didn't. Sometimes the quietest veterans were the most dangerous. As he headed to his usual breakfast at Sally's Diner, Frank carried himself differently. The other customers noticed the change but couldn't quite place it. Gone was the slight stoop in his shoulders, replaced by the straight-backed bearing of a man who had once moved silently through occupied territory, gathering intelligence that saved countless lives. Today, he would start making those calls. The confrontation Frank had been expecting finally came on a Thursday evening, just as the sun was setting over Cedar Grove. He had finished his dinner at Sally's Diner and was walking home, his cane tapping softly against the sidewalk. The street was unusually empty, and the silence made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his intelligence days in Europe. As he turned the corner onto his street, he saw them. 5 motorcycles were parked in front of his house, their engines still ticking as they cooled. Snake and 4 of his toughest-looking Iron Riders were waiting on his front lawn, deliberately trampling what remained of his flower beds. "Evening, old-timer," Snake called out, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "We thought it was time for a proper chat about your future in this neighborhood." Frank continued walking, his pace steady and unhurried. His alert eyes noticed how the bikers had positioned themselves, 2 on either side, with Snake in the middle. It was meant to be intimidating, but to Frank's trained eye, it left several escape routes open, not that he planned to run. "Beautiful evening for a chat," Frank replied calmly, stopping at the edge of his property. He could smell beer on their breath, even from several feet away. His right hand gripped his cane a little tighter, though not out of fear. Snake pulled out a piece of paper from his leather jacket. "Got some paperwork here, Gramps. Deed transfer for your property. All you have to do is sign, take the money we're offering, and roll on out of here. Nobody needs to get hurt." One of the other bikers, a muscular man with a shaved head, cracked his knuckles loudly. "Would be a shame if you had a fall, old man. At your age, broken bones don't heal so good." Frank's blue eyes, which had seen the horrors of war and the darkness in men's souls, met Snake's gaze steadily. "You boys seem to be operating under some misconceptions," he said, his voice carrying the same tone he had used when interrogating Nazi informants. "First, you assume that because I'm old, I'm afraid. Second, you think that because I've been patient, I'm weak." He took a step forward, and despite themselves, the bikers shifted uneasily. There was something in the old man's bearing that had changed. Gone was the quiet gardener they had been bullying. In his place stood someone else, someone who radiated quiet danger. "But your biggest mistake," Frank continued, "was assuming you knew who I was. You saw an old veteran and thought that was the whole story. You never stopped to ask what kind of veteran you were dealing with." Snake tried to maintain his threatening demeanor, but uncertainty had crept into his expression. "Are you threatening us, old man? Because that would be a very stupid thing to do." Frank allowed himself a small smile, the kind of smile that had made German officers nervous during interrogations. "Threats are for amateurs, son. I'm simply telling you how this is going to play out. In about 30 seconds, you're going to get a phone call. The number will be blocked. You might want to answer it." As if on cue, Snake's phone began to ring. He pulled it out, staring at the screen in confusion. The other bikers watched, their confident sneers fading as their leader's face grew pale while listening to the voice on the other end. "How did you?" Snake started to ask, but Frank cut him off. Remember when I told you that some of us elderly folks live around here? Well, some of us elderly folks also have friends in interesting places. Friends who have been very curious about your operation ever since I sent them certain photographs and documents. Snake's phone rang again. This time, when he answered, beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. The other bikers watched in growing unease as their unshakable leader began to tremble slightly. Last chance, boys, Frank said quietly, stepping past them toward his front door. You can leave now, never come back, and maybe, just maybe, my friends will focus their attention elsewhere, or you can stay and find out exactly what kind of resources a former military intelligence operator can bring to bear. The sound of distant sirens began to float on the evening air. Snake's phone buzzed again with a text message that made him curse under his breath. The mighty leader of the Iron Riders suddenly looked very small indeed. After sending the Iron Riders running from his lawn, Frank Thompson sat in his study, surrounded by the evidence he had collected over the past weeks. His old military radio equipment, still in working order after all these years, hummed softly in the corner. The clock on the wall showed 9:30 p.m., but his night was far from over. Frank opened his laptop and clicked on a secure email address he hadn't used in decades. His fingers moved slowly but surely across the keyboard as he typed out messages to 3 different people. The first went to Admiral James Conway, now retired but still deeply connected to naval intelligence. They had worked together during a classified operation in 1944, and James had always said he owed Frank his life. The second message went to Sarah Mitchell, who now held a high position in the FBI's Organized Crime Division. Few people knew that her father had been part of Frank's intelligence unit during the war, and that Frank had been her godfather. She had grown up hearing stories about the quiet pharmacist who had once helped break up Nazi spy rings. The third and most important message went to an encrypted address that even Frank didn't know belonged to whom. It was a contact protocol established during the Cold War, a last resort for operatives who needed to activate certain resources without going through official channels. As he waited for responses, Frank pulled out the thick file of evidence he had compiled. His photos showed more than just local harassment. He had captured images of late-night meetings between the Iron Riders and known crime figures, documented suspicious packages changing hands, and recorded license plates that traced back to 3 different states. His cell phone rang at exactly 10:00 p.m. The voice on the other end was familiar, despite the decades that had passed. Frank Thompson, said Admiral Conway, his voice warm but serious. When I saw your code name pop up, I thought there must be some mistake. It's been what, 30 years? 32, Frank replied, smiling slightly. James, I need to call in that favor you promised me in Paris. For the next hour, Frank laid out everything he had discovered about the Iron Riders. It wasn't just about his property anymore. His military training had helped him uncover a pattern that suggested the motorcycle club was part of a larger criminal network involved in weapons trafficking and money laundering. His second call came from Sarah Mitchell at the FBI. Godfather, she said, using her old nickname for him, I'm looking at the files you sent. Do you realize what you've stumbled onto? We've been trying to build a case against these people for months. I had a feeling, Frank replied, his voice steady. That's why I waited until I had enough evidence. Everything is documented, dated, and verified, just like you taught me to do when you were a rookie agent, and I helped you study for your FBI exams. The third response came by email, just 2 words long. Assets deployed. Frank knew what that meant. By morning, various government agencies would be very interested in the Iron Riders' activities. As midnight approached, Frank made one final call to Officer Jim Parker at the local police department. Jim, he said kindly, I suggest you keep your officers away from the motorcycle club's property tomorrow. Some federal agents will be handling that situation. Federal agents? Jim sounded confused. Mr. Thompson, what did you do? Frank looked out his window at the now quiet street. Let's just say I reached out to some old friends who take motorcycle gangs very seriously. Before going to bed, Frank opened the small wooden box that contained his war medals. Among them was a small, unmarked silver pin, the only proof of his service in military intelligence. He had never shown it to anyone, not even Martha. Tomorrow, it would no longer matter if people knew about his past. As he prepared for bed, following his usual routine despite the extraordinary evening, Frank smiled at what the morning would bring. The Iron Riders were about to learn a valuable lesson. Sometimes the quietest veterans were the ones you needed to watch out for the most. The next morning dawned clear and bright over Cedar Grove. Frank was up at his usual time of 6 o'clock a.m., going through his morning routine as if it were any other day. He made his bed with military precision, brewed his coffee, and sat by his kitchen window. The only difference was that today, he was waiting. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the first signs of activity appeared. Black SUVs with tinted windows began rolling quietly into town. They moved like a well-coordinated team, taking up strategic positions around the Iron Riders property. Frank counted 12 vehicles in total, their government plates gleaming in the morning sun. Snake and his gang members were still sleeping off their previous night's party when the raid began. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air as two military-style choppers appeared overhead. Frank calmly sipped his coffee as he watched teams of agents in tactical gear emerge from the SUVs. FBI, this is a federal raid. The announcement boomed through powerful speakers, echoing across the quiet neighborhood. Frank watched as confused neighbors stepped onto their porches, witnessing what would become the most exciting day in Cedar Grove's recent history. The Iron Riders scrambled out of their makeshift clubhouse, but they found themselves surrounded. Snake, trying to run for his motorcycle, was quickly tackled by two agents. His tough guy facade crumbled as he was handcuffed and read his rights. Other gang members tried to resist, but the federal agents were too well prepared and too numerous. Sarah Mitchell, Frank's goddaughter from the FBI, supervised the operation from the command center set up in one of the larger SUVs. She caught Frank's eye through his kitchen window and gave him a small salute. He nodded back, remembering how she used to sit at this same kitchen table doing her homework while he taught her about investigation techniques. Local news vans began arriving, their reporters excitedly broadcasting live updates. In a stunning development, one reporter announced, "Federal authorities are conducting a massive raid on the Iron Riders Motorcycle Club. Sources say the gang is suspected of involvement in a multi-state criminal enterprise, including weapons trafficking and money laundering." Officer Jim Parker and his local police officers stood at the perimeter, helping to control the growing crowd of onlookers. Jim kept glancing at Frank's house with a mixture of surprise and respect, finally understanding why the quiet old veteran had remained so calm in the face of the gang's intimidation. As agents searched the property, they discovered exactly what Frank's surveillance had indicated: hidden weapons caches, drug shipments, and documentation of illegal activities across several states. His detailed notes and photographs had given the FBI exactly what they needed to obtain search warrants and make the arrests stick. Inside the gang's clubhouse, agents found a wall covered with maps and photos. Among them was a plan to force out local property owners, including Frank, to establish a larger base of operations. The Iron Riders had chosen Cedar Grove because they thought it was just another quiet town full of easy targets. They had never expected to encounter someone like Frank Thompson. By noon, the raid was complete. 27 members of the Iron Riders were in custody, their motorcycles impounded as evidence. The property that had been the source of so much trouble was now sealed with yellow crime scene tape. Neighbors who had been too afraid to support Frank during the gang's reign of terror now gathered around him, offering apologies and congratulations. Sally from the diner brought him his usual breakfast personally, insisting on serving it right to his door. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her eyes wet with tears, "I'm so sorry we weren't braver when you needed us." Frank just smiled gently. "Sometimes, Sally, the best way to fight isn't with fists or angry words. Sometimes it's about being patient, gathering information, and knowing when to make the right calls." As the federal agents prepared to leave, Sarah came over to give her godfather a hug. "You know," she said, loud enough for others to hear, "that intelligence you gathered was better than what some of our active agents produce. Sure you don't want to come out of retirement?" Frank chuckled, looking at his garden. Some of his trampled roses were already showing signs of new growth. "No, thank you," he replied. "I think I'll stick to gardening. But it's nice to know I haven't lost my touch." 3 months after the raid that changed Cedar Grove forever, Frank Thompson's garden was once again in full bloom. New roses, planted with help from his neighbors, had replaced the ones destroyed by the Iron Riders. The garden was more beautiful than ever, with the whole community pitching in to restore what had been lost. The old veteran's quiet heroism had transformed Cedar Grove in unexpected ways. His house, once a target of intimidation, had become something of a local landmark. People would often stop by to chat, bring him baked goods, or simply ask for advice. The younger veterans in town, who had previously known him only as the quiet old man from the diner, now visited regularly to hear his stories and learn from his wisdom. Sally's diner had undergone its own transformation. Frank's usual booth now bore a small brass plaque that read, "Reserved for Frank Thompson, hero of Cedar Grove." Every morning at 8:30, you would arrive to find his coffee already waiting, often accompanied by admiring glances from other customers who had read about his exploits in the local newspaper. The Cedar Grove Gazette had run a front-page story titled, "World War II Veteran Brings Down Criminal Enterprise." The article detailed Frank's military intelligence background and how his careful observation and patience had helped federal authorities dismantle not just the local gang, but a criminal network spanning 3 states. The story had been picked up by national news outlets, making Frank a minor celebrity. Officer Jim Parker had been promoted to police chief after the incident, and he made it a point to stop by Frank's house every week for coffee and conversation. "You taught us all a valuable lesson," Jim would say. "Age doesn't determine courage, and quiet strength can be the most powerful kind." Sarah, Frank's goddaughter from the FBI, had ensured that her godfather received proper recognition for his role in the investigation. A formal letter of commendation from the FBI director now hung on Frank's wall, next to his World War II medals. But what meant more to him was the personal note Sarah had written. "You're still teaching me, Godfather. Thank you for showing us that a true hero never really retires." The vacant lot where the Iron Riders had caused so much trouble was transformed as well. The city council, inspired by Frank's service, voted to turn it into a veterans' memorial park. Frank was asked to be the guest of honor at the groundbreaking ceremony, where he planted the first tree, a sturdy oak that would grow to provide shade for future generations. Young people in Cedar Grove began treating their elderly neighbors with new respect, realizing that behind each wrinkled face might lie an extraordinary story. The local high school even started a program where students would interview veterans and senior citizens, recording their histories and experiences for future generations. One sunny afternoon, as Frank sat in his garden enjoying the peace he had helped restore, he heard the sound of motorcycles approaching. But this time, instead of feeling dread, he smiled. It was the local chapter of the Veterans Motorcycle Club, a group of former service members who had made it their mission to check on Frank regularly and ensure no trouble ever came to Cedar Grove again. Their leader, a Gulf War veteran named Mike, always parked his bike carefully to avoid disturbing Frank's flowers. "Just checking in, sir," he would say with a respectful nod, "making sure everything's quiet in the neighborhood." Martha's photo still sat on Frank's bedside table, and sometimes in the evening you would talk to it softly. "You would have loved seeing all this, dear," he would say. "The garden's beautiful again, and the whole town has become like family." Sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting, but from staying true to who you are. As Frank Thompson approached his 94th birthday, he had become more than just a local hero. He was a living reminder that courage comes in many forms, that age is no barrier to making a difference, and that sometimes the quietest people have the most extraordinary stories to tell. The Iron Riders were gone, but they had left behind an unexpected gift. A stronger community, united by the example of one elderly veteran who had shown them all what real strength looks like.